I'm delighted to be welcoming director, producer and lecturer Sophie Larsmon to the stage shortly, who will be exploring how data can be used as an asset within the creative process of making meaningful immersive experiences, as well as how diagramming can be an effective tool when creating new forms of experience. Welcome, Sophie.
Thank you. Before I properly kick off, something that I learned etiquette-wise from another symposium I attended a week or so ago at the National is I'm going to quickly just describe myself for those who are partially sighted or blind. So I'm Sophie, my pronouns are she, her, I'm 37, I'm 5'7", I'm medium build, medium hair, I'm wearing a sort of flowery jumpsuit and heels, and I've probably got too much makeup on. So that is me. What about you? I'd really like to know before we kick off who we've got in the room. So what about, do we have any designers in the room? Designers in terms of costume, wardrobe, lighting? Yeah, cool, lovely. What about directors? We've got any other fellow directors in the room? Cool. Hello. Producers? Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, Matthew, ARG, entrepreneur. Wonderful. Anyone else that I've sort of missed out? Shout out. Oh, cool. Data scientist. Oh my God, you're going to know so much more than me. Okay, cool. Pardon? Game designers. Excellent. Okay, lovely. Thank you for sharing that, because that's going to help shape what I talk about. And I feel like I should probably give you a little bit more about me. I'd like you to take a moment before I do that to think about why you're here, why you're in this theatre. There are two other very interesting talks going on, the Gunpowder Plot and the National. If you want to go now, go, it's fun. What's brought you here? Have a think about that, because in understanding why you're here, we might be able to dig in to meaning and what we all individually and collectively find meaningful. So, let me tell you a little bit about me. I sadly no longer look like that, post 2 children. I should probably get that updated. I'm going to frame this talk as a personal journey. So I was a theatre producer, and then I became a theatre director, and then I became a director of immersive theatre, and now I sort of term myself as a director of immersive theatre and an experience designer. And along my professional journey, I've had the absolute pleasure of working on some really big, large-scale immersive experiences with some of the big dogs, if you like, which I'm not going to name because I might potentially about to offend. But that was wearing my production manager hat, so I was sort of doing company manager roles, which I never really wanted to do. I was sort of moonlighting a little bit whilst I was cutting my teeth as a director. And they were great. They were fun. They were exciting. Spectators, audiences loved them. I personally felt like it was a step in the right direction for me, because as a producer, I was sort of stuck behind the desk and I wanted to be out there with people. But I am going to offend some people here, and I'm sorry. For me, they just felt a bit empty, a little bit vacuous. And don't get me wrong, they were amazing spectacles, and they were things that fully immersed people in other worlds. And I do respect and remain friends with a lot of people who make them, and some of whom are here today. There is absolutely a market for those experiences as well, I should say, like 100%. But for me, they felt a little bit empty. And I began to think, well, if the experience economy is booming, then why do so many experiences feel empty? They might be visually stunning. They might have the wow factor when you first walk in. And a lot of these immersive experiences, they tend to focus on the novelty of physical immersion. But we're more than just bodies, aren't we? We're minds, and we're hearts. And it's not enough, I don't think, just to be physically immersed. We need to be psychologically immersed too. In fact, some people say that really to be truly immersed You have to be physically immersed, psychologically immersed, and ontologically immersed. That is, that the immersive experiences that we attend, they need to resonate with our sense of meaning. I got into theatre, arts, culture, whatever you want to call it, because I wanted to make people feel something. I wanted to help enable the rare, but sometimes amazing moments where you get, the shivers down the spine, the hairs standing up on end. And I wanted to help create those sorts of moments, where people can't wait to get to the bar afterwards and talk about it and chew it over, that sort of thing. I wanted to get into theatre because I wanted to help people celebrate being alive. Thinking back to the live experiences that really, really, really rocked me to my core, it's sort of more traditional theatre. It's things like A Disappearing Number. Did anyone see A Disappearing Number, Complicité, many moons ago? Or Black Watch, National Theatre of Scotland's Black Watch. Anybody see that? The stuff The Wonderful World of Dissociate, it was another National Theatre of Scotland show. People, Places and Things. Anyone see that? That was a headlong production. When I think about what these have in common, well, I know at least 4 of them were really heavily devised with the company. So although there was a script, the writer was in the room with the actors writing what came out of improvisations. And also, interestingly, in fact, all of those ones that I've just listed were very ensemble heavy. They really relied on the power of the ensemble, and that's something I want to get back to later as well. All these pieces had beautiful rises of tension, falls and rises. They had well-developed, believable characters. They had well-crafted, complicated, beautiful, messy relationships with other well-developed, believable characters. Now, according to Frank Rose, is this going to work? No. What researchers are finding is that we seem to understand stories by projecting ourselves into them. That the more fully we project ourselves, the more immersed we become, the more likely the story is to affect our attitudes on what the story is about. And if we really care about the characters we're watching, we'll project ourselves more. We'll immerse ourselves psychologically, narratively, perhaps even ontologically, more. We'll have our attitudes on what the story is about affected more. Now, I can't actually remember the ins and outs of the plot of those productions that I've just listed, nor can I really actually remember any of the lines of text, but I can absolutely remember how each of them made me feel. Brilliant quote here by Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So I started to carve out a career in this art form, an art form which I knew could create these moments of feeling for others, hoping that I might maybe be able to create other meaningful moments for them too. And I just would like you now to get your pens and paper out, if you haven't already, and have a think about what meaningful means for you. How do you want to make people feel in the experiences that you design? I guess it doesn't have to be pens and paper, it could be your phone. I'm an old-fashioned kind of gal, but write it down, okay? We're going to revisit it later. Okay, so things were beginning to go quite well on the theatre directing front. It took a while, believe me, it took a while, but things were beginning to go quite well on the straight theatre front. And then I got approached by two Americans. Two Americans walked into a bar. No, they didn't. They came into the National Theatre Cafe, where I was on a lunch break, and they told me that they wanted to set up an immersive theatre production that they wanted to do in London. And one of them, Justin, was one of the co-founders of this new company, Any One Thing. He'd been an employee of a software development company called Litmus, and he and his boss at Litmus, who was Paul Fennell, who was the other co-founder of the company, they decided that they wanted to see whether they could bring some of the tools and tricks of their trade, which was e-marketing, into immersive theatre. They'd both seen Sleep No More several times in New York, absolutely loved it. But more than that, Paul had been deeply inspired by a workshop that he took over a weekend in New York by a company called Odyssey Works. Has anyone heard of Odyssey Works? Yeah, okay, great. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them later. So Justin, he was one of the Americans. Annie, she was the other one. She was a company manager, and she actually had a background in theatre and the arts. And she promptly told Justin and Paul that they would probably need a director who knew something about theatre if they were going to indeed make theatre, immersive or otherwise. So that's where I came in. And by the time I was on board this first project called Recollection, they had already actually got quite far down the process. They had a script written by Richard Pucci. There was a venue, a dilapidated building, but still a venue. And there was the beginnings of a bespoke personalization platform. And I was like, say what? Like, what? An enrichment engine. For those who didn't attend the show, I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about it. Whistle stop, because we haven't got loads and loads of time. Recollection. So it starred 3 people, Rebecca Ward, Benedict Hudson, and Anna Carfora. You booked your tickets like you would a regular show. So, you gave us your name, your email address, your mobile number. And then you get a message 24 hours in advance to say, meet in a pub not too far from Borough Station. And then you get a text message whilst you're at this pub asking you to go to a specified location. There are only 6 of you in the audience. You all got this message at the same time. You're like, oh, cool. You go walk along and you meet this person, Sarah. Now, Sarah, she's a bit intense. She's obviously had some stuff sort of happening to her. And you begin to hear that she woke up on a bench one day in Carlisle, I think it was, randomly, and she couldn't remember a thing. She couldn't remember anything about herself. And bit by bit, she has been trying to piece herself back together again. And then thankfully, one day she comes across a man called Josh who helps her to fill in the gaps. She used to work for a company called Memorious, who specialised in memory deletion. And you are here, the audience member, as the 6 of you, because Josh has told her, Sarah, that you once knew each other. Now, you wouldn't remember that because you've also had the procedure done. You have had selective memories erased. So she's got you on side, and after a briefing with Josh in this blacked out van in an underground car park near London Bridge, you accept your mission of breaking into the old HQ of Memorious, which is this derelict building that I was referring to, which actually is no longer there. And you help her to retrieve your file. You help her to retrieve her file to help her remember who she was. And once you're inside, you step into this small abandoned office space that belonged to somebody called Dr. Sorensen. And there's a sort of escape room element to it. It's fun, you have to work together. Sarah goes off somewhere else, which you kind of need. You need that break from her, it's been quite intense. And you get to work together with these other audience members to find a key to unlock the filing cabinet, which holds all of the old dossiers on former patients. So there you are, looking for Sarah's, and boom. You're faced with your own dossier. So through the information that you've given us during the ticket booking process and the fact that you have ticked a little T's and C's box, the enrichment engine has essentially scraped the internet for your personal data, and it's automatically pulled it into these pre-designed templates, both physical and digital props. And I can tell you, it was truly chilling. Like, some people were just like, other people were like, no! Like, it really shook people. Some people afterwards sent us emails being like, I'm really not cool about this. Like, how did you get my stuff? And we had to explain, well, it's personal data that you've put out there, and you ticked that little box. You let us do this procedure. You then had to download your data from this computer, and then you had to delete it from the system. And there was a cranking up of tension. There was a phone call from Dr. Sorensen. There were seeds of doubts planted about who Josh really was and whose side he was on. And then Sarah realized that she had been conned, and he works for Memorious, and he wants your data back because Memorious had locked themselves out of the old system. He's using Sarah, and he's using you. Then this results in an alarm going off, and she tells you to get out of the building, and you race back down to the van, and Josh asks you to hand over the memory stick. He's like, hand it over with all your personal data on it for safekeeping. And then he runs upstairs to stop Sarah from finding out more. A fight breaks out between the two of them, which you're watching now from inside the van on CCTV footage on screens. And you see her escape, and then within a couple of minutes, she's back with you in the van, and she's trying to tell you in a hurry what's been going on, that she's been deceived, that you've been deceived. If you hand back your memory stick, you've let Memorious win. Some people have at this stage, some people haven't. And then Josh emerges, and you watch them have it out. And having been very physically involved in the narrative up until this point, you're now spectators. You're watching a confrontation between these two characters, one of whom you feel like you know really, really well. And this is all framed through the van's windscreen. The truth is, Memorious have been blackmailing Josh. He's done something bad. He went to them to have a memory deleted, something bad, and they're like, we're going to take you, you're going to be a pawn in our game. They got him on board to make Sarah feel safe because she was onto them. So that's why they deleted all of her memories against her will. They're essentially using human memories to train their systems so that their machines can feel, not just think. And they're developing this concept in order to sell it on to other corporations, essentially making millions of pounds out of people's unwanted memories without their permission. Now look, I'm not going to lie, there were moments where it was a bit didactic. There was a lot of information that we kind of gave in monologue form. But we learned a lot from that, which I'll get into later. So she runs off, and then it seems that they're after him too, so then he legs it, and you're left alone in the van, and then suddenly a black curtain drops over the windscreen, and the inside of the van becomes like a tiny cinema. The screens that you've previously seen CCTV footage on now show Sarah, whose real name is Bethany, being taken into the memory erasing procedure, and it's intercut with photos and videos, memories of her life. We see her as a child, surrounded by family. We see her grow, surrounded by friends, surrounded by colleagues. And we now have a sense of who she was, even if she never got to find out herself. So, in terms of data, the use of personal data in recollection, it was threefold. One, it was intrinsic to the heart of the piece, right? So we were making a piece in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it was a year on, it was like a year anniversary from the introduction of General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. So form was echoing content, content was echoing form. And we never set out to lecture people about what they should do, but we wanted people to have that moment to think about their relationship with tech. What were they sharing? Who were they granting access to? And to what? When they ticked little boxes which got in their way from doing what it is that they actually wanted to do, what were they doing? It was also, secondly, a call to attention. So if we'd lost them, we got them back again. As experienced designers, one of the main materials we have is modes of attention, right? That designers of experiences, we need to think about the frames for these different modes of attention. We need to think about the different types of attention, the different intensities, the different speeds, the different rhythms. We just had quite a fun communal thing with the escape room. So we needed to bring them back in, draw them back in, create an intensity around their attention. We see you. Now come along with us. Come along on the journey. Let us transport you. Thirdly, it heightened a sense of empathy towards our protagonist, towards Sarah. So by reflecting your personal data back to you, visual depictions of your own memories, of your loved ones, when they were presented with the montage at the end of videos and photos of Bethany's life, which were associated with her forgotten memories, they deeply felt her pain. To have the ability to remember, be ripped away from you, Well, that must be heartbreaking. And the blurring of the line between fiction and reality, it pulled them back into our fictional universe. So just to come back to that quote by Frank Rose from The Sea We Swim in, How Stories Work in a Data-Driven World, what researchers are finding is that we seem to understand stories by projecting ourselves into them. That the more fully we project ourselves, the more immersed we become, the more likely the story is to affect our attitudes on what the story is about. Data, personal data, helped us do that. Now, I am aware that time is ticking, so I'm actually not going to play this video. I'll just try and summarize it. I want to talk now about another creative who is using data in a very, very different way, Rafiq Anadol. Does anyone know of Rafiq Anadol's work? Yeah? How would you sum that up? How would you sum his work up in a sentence?
Come on, really?
Yeah. So just to repeat, because some people won't be able to hear that, Rafiq, he takes data, a whole range of data, and he works with a team of data scientists, and he puts this data through various algorithms, and it comes out with these beautiful visual representations. And he did one called Melting Memories, which is what you can see here, which I would love to play you, but we haven't got enough time. I'll show you on my phone later if you're interested, which was inspired by his uncle who had Alzheimer's, and he wanted to capture what the art of remembering actually is. And so he hooked people up to ECG sensors and asked them to remember, and he captured their brain data as they were remembering, and then he took an amalgamation of that and he pumped it through the algorithm, and it came up with this beautiful sculpture. Now for him, for Rafiq, data is like a pigment. He talks about it as a pigment. He's a sculptor. There are different ways you can use data, and that is one way of doing it. Professor Luciano Floridi, I have probably pronounced that incorrectly, and I'm sorry, Professor. He's a professor of philosophy and ethics at the University of Oxford, and he's also director of the Digital Ethics Lab at the Oxford Internet Institute. And he says data, it's the interface between us and the rest of the world. In fact, it's between us and ourselves. We understand our body in terms of data. We understand society in terms of data. We understand the physics of the universe in terms of data. The economy, social science, we play with data. So essentially, it's what we interact with most regularly every day. And it can be used by different creatives to do different things. Now, in the video, which I'm not showing you, Jorge Luis Borges, who's an Argentinian writer, is referenced. And he was a big influence on Rafiq's work. He's actually also, strangely, coincidentally, an influence on Richard Pucci's work, who wrote Recollection. He wrote a short story called Funes the Memorious, which is what inspired Richard to name the corporation within Recollection Memorious. So, just to wrap up on Recollection, it was a good production. We got some really great reviews. We got some medium reviews, which mentioned the sort of didactic nature that I mentioned earlier. It was an invitation for me to come on board as the full-time in-house artistic director at Any One Thing, and it also lost a lot of money. It had 6 audience members at a time, so it was a very difficult business model. So when I came on board as artistic director, I had a very clear brief. The producer had looked at the figures of Recollection, and other than the fees for actors, stage managers, etc., which we were absolutely not going to budge on, we weren't going to cut those, the second most expensive item in the budget was venue. So even like a dilapidated tower block in London Bridge costs money. And the next show that we made, we had to hold in venues that people donated to us. We also couldn't afford to put on shows if they weren't going to sell out. So we upped the audience capacity from 6 to a grand total of 12. But the difference is that every ticket had to be shifted in order to justify the running costs and start to amortize the production costs. So we sort of took the So Far Sounds model, and we asked people to donate their homes. Theatre on your doorstep. So as creatives, we love constraints, right? We get our brains whirring with constraints. And for me, philosophically, this really excited me because the idea of bringing theatre to people's doorsteps, inviting them in through a doorway that they've walked through or walked past 100 times before was really exciting. And we could engineer an evening, a moment, an event, an experience that you're only actually going to be aware of if you live in that particular area, which I'll get back to in a sec. Off the back of the buzz of recollection, we started to grow a mailing list, and our social media following grew and grew, and we encouraged people towards our website where they could sign up to this. Prospective audience members, they shared their postcode with us, categorical data. And when we managed to find a host, there was a performance penciled in that area. People in that locale were notified and they had access to a waiting list. And if there was enough demand to fill that show, the actors and the stage managers were heavily penciled. And then people on the waiting list had a time-limited opportunity, I think it was 48 hours, to book. And if enough people booked, that's when we confirmed the show. If there wasn't enough demand, like if the waiting list hadn't converted into sales, the show didn't go ahead. And there was a 2-week window here, so we could always give the actors and the stage manager enough advance warning. And it wasn't perfect, but it was a step towards theatre on demand and hyper-local theatre. And we were essentially using people's categorical data to make an efficient booking system, one that matched demand with supply. It was basically a responsive business model. Artistically, this constraint got me thinking about No Exit, Jean-Paul Sartre's No Exit, which I'd been back at university, which famously coined the phrase, hell is other people. We were actually in touch with Sartre's estate because we thought, maybe we could do like an immersive version of No Exit, and they were like, no, it's not happening. So we were like, okay, respect. And they did us a favour because that then took us off onto this whole different journey, and we started exploring halfway about death, about the afterlife in the modern digital age, grief, relationships whilst others were alive, and also when you're gone, digital legacy, the right to be forgotten. And this began to chime with what we had started to explore in recollection, i.e. how we live our lives online, because everything online is data. A huge amount of data can be extracted from what's online. A digital footprint of human behaviour can be captured. So whereas in recollection, these images and connections were representing memories, in Souvenir we could use the personal data, things that people shared, their curated lives online, to explore who gets to curate your life when you no longer have control over it. Every image shared, every video, they're all storytelling units, aren't they? They're all storytelling units for us to tell the story or stories about ourselves that we want other people to listen to, the lives we are supposedly living. But what happens when you're no longer here? When our actual lives have ended? The internet, it's stained in ink, not in pencil. And the data that you put out there will still be there even after you've gone. If you've managed to curate a narrative, can others do the same when you're no longer here? So just to go back to Sartre for a moment, perhaps hell isn't other people. Perhaps it's living in a world where we isolate ourselves from others, relying on online likes for validation. For those who didn't see Souvenir, Whistle Stop Tour, you were invited as guests to a surprise party. You arrived and you were greeted with a, hey, Sheena, how are you? Oh my goodness, I hear that you've just organised this amazing symposium. Or, David, how are you? Happy birthday for last week. How was it in Folkestone? Okay, good. We got these little tidbits of information and we wove it into the narrative. Anna, it turned out, spoiler alert, is dead. Halfway through the experience, you realise that actually what you are a part of is a simulation that her husband is playing again and again and again in order for him to deal with his grief. And you, the audience members, are there as your digital representations of yourself, what you have curated about the world, for the world to know about you, I will very happily talk to people about Souvenir till the cows come home, so come and grab me in the break if you want to know more. But this brief was set and handed over to the writer, Tristan Bernays, and I had the wonderful opportunity, whilst he was writing, to head over to the States and do this workshop with Odyssey Works. And that they were the company, if you remember, who had inspired Paul to set up Any One Thing. And it was here that I learned lots of tricks and tools and tips about experience design, things like radical empathy, sensory isolation and enhancement, creating a container, and diagramming. We got there. So we're going to zoom in on diagrams very briefly. We haven't got much time, but I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour. Although this talk has both data and diagramming in the title, I'm not actually talking about data visualization here. I want you to think about diagrams as process-orientated tools for making. They're also dynamic, they're exploratory, and let's face it, if you're inventing form, you need a new notation form. Abraham Bjurickson, he's the artistic director of Odyssey Works. He, by the way, is absolutely the expert in diagramming, not me. I would strongly encourage you to buy his book, which is coming out at the end of this month, I think. Yeah, it's in a couple of weeks. And also potentially do his 3-hour workshop online where he can really take a deep dive into diagramming. But what I'm going to quickly share with you is what I learned from him and how that had an impact on Souvenir. So, according to Abe, we have got 3 different categories when it comes to diagramming. We have symbols, we have graphs, and we have maps. And these categories, they can overlap. They're not entirely discrete, but each one of them has its own design possibilities, and inviting you, the designer, the experience designer, to restructure experiences in a powerful way. So let's whiz through these, shall we? Number 1, symbols. A symbol is a graphic image that represents something. It accrues meaning. It might have inherent meaning. So if you think of a letter or a glyph, that's a really good example of a symbol. It functions in a way that we as a community have decided it will work. There's education involved in that symbol. We have educated each other. We have shared cultural background in order that it can represent something. That's why we need keys. Keys help us understand what symbols, what meaning the symbols are imbued with, and it can guide all of our design ideas. It can take a complex theoretical idea or ideas, and that can all be contained within a symbol. And they accrue meaning because these meanings are things we have agreed on. To select a symbol for your diagram is to select a purpose. This is us. So I should briefly say that after being a fellow on the masterclass in New York, I then worked with Abe quite closely over the pandemic, and then I got invited to be one of the facilitators of the Odyssey Works masterclass in Portugal last summer. And this is us, this is the team. Very strange time, still wearing masks. And this is the team looking at how to use symbols and diagramming more widely. Our main symbol was of a beetle, and that was because we were making an odyssey for an individual called Jude who had come over to Portugal, and he had got a tattoo of this beetle on his arm. Now, we only knew about that because we were in conversation with his friends. He didn't know that we had that information. But to us, we really latched on to that symbol. It had various meanings for us, which again I will tell you later in the bar if you're so interested, but I need to skip over it for now. And it was also a collaboration tool. So you'll see that in this video there are several different types of people working together. We all came from different backgrounds. So we've got We've got a data scientist, we've got an experiential producer, we've got Manera. I don't even know how you describe Manera. She's part poet, part mystic. She's Manera. You had me as a theatre director, immersive director. We had costume designers. We could all come around the table together and use symbols and the other diagramming tools to talk to each other. We had a way to unify under a single vision. So if we were to summarize that, I'd say that symbols offer us that opportunity to crystallize complex concepts into a shorthand that can define one's project. Numero dos, graphs. So grids, charts. On a graph where everything is located, that tells you something. So the Cartesian graph with the x-axis and the y-axis, that's a good starting point, but it's actually not the only form that a graph has to take. There are axes, which is a measurement of values against a grid of some sort, and more likely than not, it contains a symbol. The graph is able to give a really clear visual representation of intensities measured against each other, which can be really, really useful. And we're well trained on graphs, aren't we? We kind of understand that they usually move from left to right, and that with scale, we understand that the further away from the point of origin usually represents an increase. So anything that you can measure against a point of origin, anything that has a basic measurement system in the background is a graph, and it's very, very useful for comparing things. It can also not be linear, it can be circular. They drive home the incredible capacity of diagramming to use relationships between things as the compositional engine of a design. Now here we have the Book of Separation, which was the project that I mentioned that I worked with Abe during the pandemic. Very fancy diagram. This is a graph. And basically, given that the world had shut down because of the pandemic, we needed to find a new way to rediscover closeness. And Zoom just didn't cut it. We all had Zoom fatigue, right? So Abe came to Any One Thing, technical wizards, not me, my colleagues, and he said, how do we do this? And he built this he asked us, or we offered, to build a new platform called One Thing. And the Book of Separation, it was for 2 people at a time. So you have person A and person B, and the overall theme of the piece was this intertwining of coming together and being forced apart. Because you could do this experience with somebody in the next room, or you could do it with somebody in another continent. And this was a really, really useful tool for us. There was a script. The script was given to the actors who did the pre-recording, but a script wasn't dynamic in the way that this diagram is. It meant that we had a sort of macro overall vision on the piece. This is actually how it looked. You know, so the fancy one is what we can talk about in hindsight. They're things that you want to twist, you want to move this line, you want to experiment. This bit doesn't work, so maybe we need to put that bit there. That is the great thing about diagrams. They're to be used within the process. Sum up. Graphs. They focus the design process on the relationships and the dynamisms that bring life to what we've made, or what we are indeed seeking to make. And finally, we have maps. So, maps, as Abe taught me, is not the territory. Abe was very clear about that. Maps describe a territory on the basis of a specific set of priorities. So it can be utilitarian, like when we think of maps, we probably think of Google Maps, getting from point A to point B. But that's just a set of priorities on the vast majority of maps that we encounter day to day. It doesn't have to be that way, though. So this here is a map by Christian Knowles. It's the San Francisco Emotion map, which he made in 2007. And back in 2007, the iPhone had only just come out. We didn't have iPhones in our back pockets. We didn't have these GPS systems. And this was Noel's attempt to visualize the space of human perception and experience. So he had 98 participants over a 5-week period who walked around San Francisco with this biomapping device, which was his own invention. And it was a combined finger cuff sensor, which recorded people's galvanic skin response, GSR, which could take an index of emotional response in conjunction with their GPS. So participants were encouraged to do a little geotag and mark the intensity of their emotion whenever they felt something, when something they came across evoked a reaction. And it might not be as useful as Google Maps in terms of, like, you know, if you need to know where the nearest grocery store is because toddler's having a meltdown and you need to get banana in their gob. But as a fellow said, actually, yeah, in that session with Abe, it could be useful if someone, say, is suffering from anxiety and they really want to know where somewhere quiet is, somewhere they can contemplate, or indeed where they need to avoid if it's caused a lot of people high adrenaline. Maps invite us to clarify and specify what matters in the world that we're making. So just to summarize, they can act as a facilitator in the creative process. They can encode ideas and priorities, and they can structure relationships. And it was this thinking that took me back to the UK and create a souvenir with our wonderful designers, Abby and Alice, and I briefed them on what I've just briefed you, and they came up with this wonderful diagram, which is a visual representation of the flow of the experience, of the rhythm, which informed my conversations with Tris, the writer. So when he was rewriting bits, I was like, actually, we need more moments of one-to-one interaction here, engagement. Maybe actually now we can afford to take a deep dive into the narrative immersion there. You know, earlier I referred to frames of attention. Well, here we had to do something similar in terms of framing of attention and pulling focus like one might do in like a normal theatre set. Apart from us, it wasn't a regular theatre set because we were changing venues every night. So instead, what we had to do was something that I call responsive design, which actually is, an aside, something in the tech and software world, not a million miles away from what Litmus used to do. But it basically meant that Abby and Alice, that's the QR code to their Instagram, by the way, if you're interested. We had to think about the story spatially in zones based upon some pre-agreed rules that we found together in the rehearsal room. It was the opposite of a model box. It was the opposite of blocking and staging. The responsive design, based on the room on offer, it was just like the responsive dialogue based on who was in the room and what we knew about them. So this was a new sort of type of site-specific performance. It was one that empowered the ensemble, just to come back to the ensemble, because I had to step away. I was having a baby, so I couldn't go into the new venue with them every night. They had these rules in their head, and then they did the staging of it. It was also a new sort of personalised experience. So to wrap up, experience is continuous. Attention is a limited window. We use frames to change attention. It structures consciousness. Experience design is concerned with the internal experiences of an audience. We're interested in how the work we do connects to our audience's understanding of world and self. And that's what I've tried to do for you today. I've tried to design a meaningful experience. I don't know if I've succeeded, but I've tried. You've gifted me 60 minutes of your time, and that was a choice that you made. That's a privilege for me. You could have gone to hear the National Theatre. You could have gone to hear the Gunpowder Plot. I crafted this experience with you in mind. I gathered as much information about you at the beginning of the talk that I could, in terms of who was in the room. I also got in touch with the Immersive Experience Network team last week to try and get more data on the room, on the setup, like how this was going to work. I've tried to move you between active and receptive states, should say receptive, not responsive. And And of course, it doesn't end with this presentation. 60-minute liners here, but hopefully you'll now go and take these tools and you'll go on and on and on and on and on, and you'll try them and you'll fail, and that's fine, and you'll try them again and again and again. Experience is continuous. Go back now to that card, to the thing that you wrote down on your phone or on your paper earlier on. Please. What does meaningful mean to you? Has that changed over the last 60 minutes? How do you want to make people feel when you design your experiences? And if you don't know, try using a diagram. My wish for you is that you leave here feeling inspired to try these tools out in your work and go forth and design more meaningful experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, one at the front here.
I knew someone would ask me that question. And as a non-techie person, I was like, better do my homework and find out. It was a bespoke platform that was built on React, Ruby, Rails, and Postgres. And it's something that's proprietary to any one thing. I should say now that any one thing is now, they've pivoted. So I've actually now left any one thing. Because they've moved away from immersive experiences. They're now using the stack to do a very interesting political journalism tool, which I'm happy to talk to you about afterwards as well. But yeah, that's what it was built on. Oh, that's a good question. In all honesty, I can't entirely remember. I think the fact that it didn't have a set location and you only knew your location, you were told that you would be told the piece's location 24 hours before, I think gave people the expectation that they weren't going to be sitting in a theatre. But I don't think we explicitly said, you're going to be on the streets, you're going to be breaking into a building. So, Paul Fennell, who was the founder of Litmus, that's sort of what he was that's what he's a guru in. Litmus is about e-marketing and how a user interacts with emails and marketing campaigns across different browsers and across different devices. So his expertise was in the room helping us with that, but I wouldn't say that we use any particular tools and processes within a sprint on the experience. It was more just sort of through osmosis. Thank you for asking. So I'm now freelance. I'm in conversations with Paul and Annie about buying the IP of Souvenir because I want it to have another life. I feel like it was only really the beginning and it was cut short because of the pandemic, really. So hopefully Souvenir will be coming back, but in a 3-part series. So I think this is the first part of a trilogy, and I think there's something really cool that we could do with AI to help bridge into a second live experience. So watch out for that. Hopefully that's going to be happening soon. And I've also beginning to set up a company called Iskra. I'm looking for other partners to join me on that journey, particularly other women from different art forms. I'm interested in setting up a transmedia sort of network where we can work together. So if anyone is interested, come and chat to me afterwards. I hear you. I reckon you need to get around a table with your team and diagram the hell out of it. Because there are different points where you could go off on that juncture, right? If you get a graph and you think about it in terms of what we want to give people from an information perspective and what we want to give people from a narrative perspective, then perhaps you can play around in the process of the curve of that. You may well sort of do one thing, come across something, and then you test it out in previews and you're like, oh no, that was too sciencey. And so you can then come back to the diagram and think, okay, we need to come to that point earlier on. We need to go into a character arc there. We need to take them on a different journey. I do. So I'm hugely inspired by Rafiq Anadol's work. I think it's incredible. And one day, I would love to experiment with that sort of thing in terms of live dynamic responsive sets. I think there's something potentially really cool about taking an audience's data somehow, yet to work that out, and blur that into the physical set of an experience. But right now, what interests me as a storyteller, as a creative, is something more specific than that. It's having a real understanding of people through their personal data that they share and weaving that into narrative rather than abstract form. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Good. Pleasure.
Okay, you're here all day, right?
I'm here all day.
Okay, please go and find Sophie at some point after this.
Yeah, do. Yeah. Find me.
Thank you so
have me a
much.
coffee or whatever. Thank you for giving me your time.
That was amazing.
And have a lovely, lovely day.